Hi, everybody. Welcome to Paranormal Zone TV. I want to thank you all so much for being here on our early show tonight. We have a great guest. Now, for those who may be watching new to the show or who is even watching that haven't subscribed, if you like the show, if you would please subscribe, I'd appreciate it. Also, if you like the show, if you would please give me a like, I'd like that as well. Thank you. So, my guest tonight is Tom Schroder. He is an author, a journalist, and an editor. He is the author of 5 books, which can be purchased on Amazon. Tom Schroder is an award winning investigative journalist and an editor for nearly 40 years. His book editing projects include 2 New York Times bestsellers. As an editor of the Washington Post magazine, Tom was awarded 2 Pulitzer Prizes for feature writing. Tom is the author of Old Souls, which is our topic tonight. He is on chronicling his adventure with Dr. Ian Stevenson, a psychiatrist through the Eastern world, a mission to investigate and document some of the most astonishing phenomena of our time. Children who speak of past life memory and reincarnation. Now, these small children spontaneously speak of previous lives. They beg to be taken home. They want to be with their mothers and husbands and mistresses from another life and know things that there seems to be no normal way for them to know. So, with that, let me bring on Tom. Hey, Tom, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Norene. I appreciate it.
Oh, I found you on YouTube and I was listening to your stories on other channels and I said, "Oh, I got to have Tom on the show." Great, great story. So, all right. So before we start the show, I have so many questions for you, but let's start with this. How did you get involved with Dr. Stevenson and reincarnation, and were you a believer?
No, I was not a believer. And actually, my bedrock belief is in science. And to me, that means that the only way to really know something is through empirical evidence and experiment. And so I was the editor of the Miami Herald Sunday magazine, and this was back in the 90s. And there was a prominent psychiatrist at Mount Sinai Hospital in Miami Beach, and named Brian Weiss. And he wrote a best-selling book about patients that he had regressed in hypnosis that he believed revealed previous lives in there. So I thought, I found it interesting that here was this sort of mainstream psychiatrist, a very prominent hospital, very well respected guy, was, professing these sort of fringe beliefs. And so that to me was a story. So I did a magazine story about him. And, I thought he was a very interesting guy, but I didn't think much of his hypnosis cases as evidence they weren't very good evidence for reincarnation, because for one thing, when you go under hypnosis, the hypnotist is actually asking you to imagine. They're putting you in a relaxed state of mind and they're saying what comes into your head. And the things that the people came up with, they were like lives in centuries earlier. They remembered being like a slave girl, or a medieval knight or something like that. And the things that they remembered, anybody could have gotten out of a historical novel or even a romance book or whatever. And there wasn't anything in there that was really compelling, that really made you believe that there wasn't another explanation for their supposed past life memories.
Oh,
But
well,
when I was doing research for this, I came across a guy named Ian Stevenson, who had been the head of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia until he became fascinated by case reports that he was collecting and the case reports were sort of all over the map, but they shared something in common, that a small child would begin speaking about what sounded like a previous life very early in their life. And so he decided that he was going to start traveling the world to investigate these cases. And some of them were incredibly hard to explain away. I mean, there would be children who, as soon as they could talk, they'd begin saying things to their parents like, "You're not my real mother and father." And then they'd say where they lived, what their name was, how many kids they had, who their husband was, and how many dogs they had, and that in some cases, what they said was specific enough so that it could indicate the life of a actual deceased person who had lived not generations before, but in the immediate years before they were born. And so Stevenson would go and investigate these cases. He'd go talk to witnesses who heard the child say things about the previous life. Then when the previous life family was identified, he'd go and interview them and see how, what their experience was with the child recognizing family members, et cetera, things like that. And I just thought, well, this is really what I should be writing about. Forget hypnosis. And it took me 2 years. Stevenson, at this time, Stevenson was about 80 years old. And he basically said he was retiring. And so, but he said, well, he would go on 2 more big research trips, one to India and one to Lebanon. And I finally persuaded him to take me along with him. And so when I wrote Old Souls, basically it was an account of these journeys that I took with Stevenson, and also, my research into what could the explanation be for this weird phenomenon of children sounding like they were remembering previous lives.
So why did he pick India?
Well, there just were a lot of, when he was looking for cases, there were a lot of case reports that were coming out of India. So he would go, and then he hooked up with a colleague that he had there, a woman named Satwant Pasricha, also a psychiatrist. And she would collect reports of children who seemed to remember previous lives. And then he'd fly over there, and they would go visit the families involved and interview them.
So tell the viewers what reincarnation is.
Well, I mean, reincarnation is the idea that when somebody dies, their soul or essence was somehow transferred to a new body, and that the person who received the soul or essence of the deceased person would in some cases remember things from that life as they're living their new life.
How long were you on this venture with Dr. Stevenson?
Oh, well, I all told, it was, I wrote the book I researched and wrote the book over about 18 months in 1997 and 98.
Okay, is there any explanation as to how these children have these past memories? Find any explanation for?
Well, no, and that's part of the problem, is that nobody really had a good theory about how a essence of personality could transfer from a person who dies and their whole body, including their brain, is completely destroyed. So what exactly is it that then transfers to, let's say, a baby or a fetus even? And there's really, I mean, some people say, well, it's some kind of energy, but of course nobody can say what that energy is, or how it transfers, or why it would pick one particular person to transfer to. Excuse me. And so, that's the problem. And so what you're left with is this very compelling phenomenon of children who really, as soon as they can talk, begin making these statements about who they once were, when they were, they said, like, when they had kids of their own, etc.
Okay, so when these children start talking at about what age, and then it increases, and then when does it stop?
Well, usually what happens is that as soon as they can communicate, they'll start saying things that, very fragmentary way, of course, when they're just learning how to talk. But then as they learn how to speak in complete sentences, they'll say things like, I lived in a house that was much bigger than this, things like that. And, or I lived, I remember getting caught in a fire,
Mm.
things like that. And so, and this will go on. And if nobody is able to connect with the person that they thought they were, usually they stop just about as they become involved in their own social lives, like around 7 or 8, that they stop talking about it, generally speaking, very commonly. However, in cases where they've said enough so that they identified a family of the deceased, then sometimes they make lifelong connections with that family, and it will continue on for into adulthood, where they're continuing to associate with the family that they remember as being their previous family.
And so, what age group were you looking for when you went to India? Did you have gender preference, age preference?
Well, it wasn't that either I or Stevenson had a preference. It was just, somebody would say, either there'd be like a newspaper story about a child who spoke about a previous life, or, for instance, when we got to India, uh, his colleague, Satwant, said, "Oh, well, somebody in my office says their niece remembered a previous life." So we get their information and we go out and visit the niece and start interviewing her and interviewing the niece's family. So it was word of mouth. It was sometimes there were reports in newspapers, and and sometimes it was just there were people that we sort of happened on, like we'd be in the hotel lobby and we'd be talking about this, and someone would hear us and say, "Oh, well, we know somebody who remembers a previous life." And so then we'd start getting the information to find out how we could contact them and go out and see them and interview them.
How long did these interviews take, and how much information did you gather before you actually qualified them as a reincarnation?
Well, we weren't qualifying anybody as a
Oh,
reincarnation.
okay.
We were getting as complete a picture as possible. And, there would be sometimes there would be multiple interviews over a period of time. And, and in India, a lot of times we would like travel for hours and hours just to get to a remote village, where somebody, where there was a case that we had heard about. And so maybe we'd drive for 8 hours, and then we'd go and spend 3 or 4 hours interviewing people, and then we drive back. So it was very time consuming. And then, once, I mean, here's an example.
Yeah.
There's in Lebanon, outside of Beirut, there was a family who said that their daughter, as soon as she could talk, began pulling the phone off the hook and speaking into it and calling for somebody named Layla. And then as she got older, she began to say that she was Layla's mother, and that she said, and she was married, and she named her husband, and she said that she had had 7 children, and she named the children and said what order they were born in. And she said, the town where she lived in. And so she had enough information there that the family made inquiries, and the family of a deceased woman, a woman who died during heart surgery, heard about this. So her now grown daughters made an unannounced visit to visit this little girl's family. And they said that as soon as they walked into the house, the little girl called them by name and said she recognized them. And the first thing she said to them was, she said, "Oh, finally, you've come to see me. And did your uncles give you my jewelry as I asked them to?"
Oh.
And this completely blew their minds, because only their family knew that when their mother was in the hospital about to get this heart operation that she died in, before she went in for the operation, she told her brothers which jewelry she wanted to give to which daughter. And so, and they hadn't told anybody this. So they were, these were sophisticated, this was a wealthy family, and they were sophisticated and educated, and they were very skeptical. But when the little girl said this to them, they couldn't deny that she was right.
Wow. Wow. How could that be? That's crazy.
Yeah.
Another thing that I had read, that Dr. Stevenson believed in reincarnation and biological intersect, meaning birthmarks and birth defects, um, claiming
Yes, there were
past.
some.
Go ahead.
We went through a case. There was this was also in Lebanon, and this man remembered, from the time he was a child, he spoke of remembering the life of somebody in a town not far from where he lived. And he remembered being murdered. He remembered being shot. And the man who he remembered was shot through the cheek, and he died of his wounds. And this guy had a birthmark on one end, and then another birthmark on the other, just matching the path where the entrance and exit wound of the bullet that killed this guy, whose life he remembered. And so, Stevenson went and got the medical records. He got the report of the autopsy report of the guy who was murdered, and looked at where the wounds were. And then he compared it to the birthmarks. And they weren't exact, but they were close. And Stevenson says, well, when you grow, your face changes proportions, et cetera. He had some, possible explanation for why it wasn't exactly right, but it was very close and very impressive. And plus, he remembered other things about the guy's life. So he actually wrote 2 volumes of cases where people remembered past lives of people who had wounds that matched up with birthmarks to some degree.
And in that book, those cases, were they all different ages?
Well, at the time that he interviewed them, they were different ages. But
For the book.
yeah, at the
Yeah.
time he interviewed them for the book and documented their birthmarks, they were different ages. For instance, there was a girl in India who, they did sort of, these were poor families, and they did kind of manufacturing where they would manufacture the wrist bangles, if you know what they are, little wrist bracelets. And in order to bend the bracelets, they used these sort of alcohol fueled lamps that they would heat them on. And uh, this little girl was kneeling on a sort of crosshatch straw mat when the um, the lamp she was using exploded and caught fire on the mat, and the little girl died. And so this girl who remembered being this little girl was a cousin or something, and she remembered being the life of the dead girl, and she had on her knees these crosshatch birthmarks that were very similar to the mats that the girl would have been kneeling on
Wow.
when.
Hey,
So yeah, go ahead.
go ahead. No, I had a question from the chat room. Tallcross wants to know, do past life traumas affect your next life?
Well, in some cases, yes, there would be people who had phobias, like somebody who drowned would be terribly afraid of water, um, and somebody who remembered the life of someone who had drowned.
Oh,
Uh, so, but not everybody had a violent death, remembered the life of someone with a violent death, and in fact, not everybody remembered dying either.
no.
Um, there there was one, there was a guy who remembered being dying in the Lebanese Civil War. He remembered sort of they were up in the hills, and he went to a place where they had a gun emplacement, and he remembered, sort of getting blown through the air and sort of being on the ground and seeing his friends sort of give up, leave him for dead. Um, but but not everybody had that kind of a dramatic ending, or they didn't even remember their death.
Tom, do you think that we've all been reincarnated?
Well, again, I said that I think you can only really know anything when there's evidence for it. And I think that these cases are a kind of evidence. But the problem is, as I said earlier, is that nobody can come up with a theory that explains how this could happen. And in fact, everything we know about science tells us, up to date, that it's not possible because, you know, more and more as we understand how the brain works, everything about your personality can be explained by actual physical things that happen in your brain. And a few years ago, some scientists um, sort of shocked rats in a maze so that they would not sort of know where they weren't supposed to go. And then they killed those rats, dissected their brains, and found the exact place in their brains where that memory of being shocked was encoded in their cells. And they transplanted it into another rat who had never had that shock training. And the new rat, reacted exactly as if he had had the shock training, which says that that memory, that experience of being shocked, was actually a physical chain of cells, and that was being able to transplant into a new brain. So if that's the case, then when a brain disintegrates, how could you possibly transfer memories? So it's a real puzzle, because the when there are thousands of these cases of children who remember previous lives, and hundreds of them at least are documented, that these children have remembered things that it seems like there's no way that they could have known. So on the one hand, you have the science that says, well, sorry, but all personality is actually a physically contained within a brain that can, when you die, the brain disintegrates. And
Mm.
on the other hand, you have so I don't really know what to say about it. I well, I went in there thinking, well, are these cases wishful thinking? Are they families that, nobody wants to die and everybody would want to believe that they come back, that their life is somehow continues. So there's a very powerful urge to believe these stories. And, and also, if you lose a loved one, you desperately want for them to come back in some form. So everybody has a huge motivation to somehow, manufacture evidence that you continue after you die. That
Well,
is a basic human desire. So I went into this thinking, well, are these people, are they either making this up to get attention? Are they crazy? Are they just sort of hallucinating? Or, are they just convincing themselves based on some random coincidences and maybe people, memories are notoriously, fragile and uncertain things. So maybe they are sort of embellishing memories without realizing it. But anyway, so every case I went into thinking, well, are any of those possibilities what's going on here? And, I just have to say that I didn't think those people definitely weren't crazy. I didn't think that they were manufacturing these stories. They weren't making them up. And, the stuff that was documented that they said and that matched the lives of other people, it was eerily on target. And so I just couldn't explain it in any normal way.
I've got to find a question. Hold on, I have a question here from Tallcross again. I can't read all of it because it's cut off. Hold on, let me see if I can enlarge this. No, I can't. Um, oh, here we go. All right, Tallcross wants to know, do we lose touch of past lives as we age? Why are children's memories so vivid?
Well, I mean, assuming that it's a real phenomenon and they're really being reincarnated, it would make sense that, the closest to the past life they are, which is when they're born, then they can't communicate it when they're born. So as soon as they can talk, it makes sense that they would start saying things as soon as they could communicate. And and it also makes sense that when they're enveloped in a new life, that as they get older and they get to the age where they start interacting with their peers and having their own social life, that this life would begin to push out the memories of the other life and become more important, that the present would become more important than the past, and that they would slowly lose the memories.
Did
It's almost like when you wake up with a dream.
Yeah.
When first thing in the morning, you can remember the whole dream in great detail, but by lunchtime, you think, "What was that dream again?" And you can't even remember it. I'm sure you've had that experience.
Well, wait a minute. But when you get older, you don't remember they say we dream every night, but when you get older, you don't remember those dreams and you don't remember dreaming when you get
Oh
older.
no, no, I remember dream. I dream
Yeah,
every
but
night.
you're still young.
I'm 70.
Oh, get out of here. You are not. And so you still dreaming vividly and you remember what you
Oh yeah,
dreamt?
every night.
Oh, how come I can't?
I don't know.
Jeez.
But if I don't make a conscious effort to remember the dream right when I wake up in the morning, by lunchtime I will have no memory. I mean, I will remember that I had a dream, but I won't be able to tell you what it was.
Okay, so well then what about, oh, I know. I had read something that Dr. Stevens had said something about reincarnation of animals and people. We don't reincarnate as an animal, do we?
Well, I mean, if we did, we wouldn't know about it, would we? Because the animals aren't
Oh,
telling us.
why would we reincarnate as an animal?
Yeah, but that's the thing is that when people start talking about reincarnation, then they start wanting to, well, how does reincarnation work? And what are the rules of reincarnation? And do you reincarnate? I mean, is karma involved? I mean, do you reincarnate if you've done bad things in life? Do you go to some lower form of life? Well, there's just no evidence one way or the other about how it works. And in Stevenson's cases, karma did not seem to play any kind of role, because somebody who lived, a blameless life would reincarnate in the worst possible circumstances, living in, in basically in the gutter, in terrible poverty and, hunger or whatever. And, and then somebody who maybe didn't live such a great life would end up, in a mansion. So there didn't seem to be any. And also, in terms of when people reincarnated, sometimes children would remember lives of people who had died a decade before they were born, and sometimes they had died just like, in the week that they were born. So there didn't seem to be any consistent pattern to that.
And years ago, I've been doing this show since 2012. Anyways, years ago, I remember talking with a couple of guests, and we would talk about this, and they said that when you're get reincarnated, that you um, you reincarnated within your same family. Like, my husband could have been my child could have been my husband, or my sister. Did you ever hear that?
Well, there were cases where people remembered the lives of grandparents or uncles, um, and the thing about those cases, though, is they're not as good evidence, because they had access through their families to information. Let's say, they said of their uncle, well, I used to love tractors. And they say, oh, well, your uncle, who you think you remember, loved tractors. And in fact, he died on the tractor when a tractor flipped over on him. And you think, well, how could the kid have known that? Well, they have photo albums. They, and the family would say, well, we never talked about it, but can you really know that for sure, that, when somebody had an uncle who died in a dramatic way, that maybe they weren't aware that the kid was listening when they were talking about it. So it's not as convincing evidence as the many cases where children remember the lives of complete strangers who lived many miles and many years before they were born, many miles away and many years before they were born. And that's more impressive, because then you think, well, really, how could this kid have known that?
Okay, what about this? What about a child that's been reincarnated and talks about his past lives, but within his own family, he might be living with one of his relatives or parents or sisters or brothers that reincarnated. Would he, but he doesn't know. Is that possible?
Yeah, I'm not sure I completely.
Okay, so this child is reincarnated within his own family, a mother, father, maybe a couple of siblings. One of those, either the mother, the father, or one of his brothers or sisters, are reincarnated from his family that he used to be a part of. Is there any
Uh,
way,
I
could
don't know. I
that?
don't know. I didn't encounter a case like that, but it's not impossible. I mean, you know.
Okay, yeah, that's okay. So, what about these poor kids that want to go home? They must
Well,
be living an
that's the
awful
thing, is that
life.
sometimes the children are very upset and they cry, and that of course makes the parents upset. And then in cases where they figure out who the family is that they're talking about and they meet, suddenly, in many cases, the child will suddenly no longer be upset. And once they meet the family, they stop talking about it. It's like, okay, they're fine now. And they just go on with their new life.
Really?
Yeah. So very often, when when they find the family and the child, and if they can meet the family, that suddenly the child's much happier, and they just sort of go on with their own life.
Um, Now there, you sent me a picture of of Suzanne and Hannah. Explain that.
Okay, now Suzanne is the little girl. The picture in the picture, she's 20, but she was the little girl I mentioned who grabbed the phone and cried Layla
Oh,
into the phone. Well, you find out that the woman whose life she apparently remembered was Hannah. And there's a physical resemblance, although that's not always the case. But I think there's a pretty strong physical resemblance there. And
yeah.
Hannah, it turns out, when she was in the hospital about to have the surgery that killed her, she wanted to. Her daughter lived in South America, and her daughter's name was Layla, and she was trying to call her to talk to her before she went in for the surgery, and couldn't get through to her. So you remember I said that the first thing this little girl did was she pulled the phone off the hook and was
Yeah.
crying into the phone, Layla, Layla. Well,
Yes.
it matched up with this woman trying to call her daughter, who's named Layla.
Oh.
And also, she became very attached to Hannah's husband, who she felt was her husband. And here's this little girl, and at the time that she was introduced to the family, this is the daughters who came and asked about the jewelry. Remember?
Uh-huh.
And so at that time, the daughters were grown up, and their father, Hannah's husband, was, an old man. But this little girl would call the old man every night and want to talk to him because she still felt like that was her husband. And the family, the family of Hannah's family was not happy about this because they did business. They were wealthy businessmen, and they did a lot of business with people in the Arab world who didn't believe in reincarnation. And so they were embarrassed by this story. And they also had the sense that, maybe the little girl's family was trying to get some of their money or something. So they tried to suppress it. And that's when the daughter said, when we went to visit these grown daughters to ask their side of the story, the grown daughter says, well, this whole thing has caused our family a lot of trouble, and we don't want to talk about this anymore. But then when I pressed them on it, they said, well, we have to admit that this little girl knew things that only our mother could have known. And so it was very difficult for us. And anyway, so the husband, the old man, sort of took us aside and said, she still calls me occasionally. And I tell her, you really have to stop calling me, not because I don't want to speak to her, but because I feel like it's stopping her from, finding a husband in this current life.
And I wonder if these children that you all talk to, or all the people that you and Dr. Stevenson has talked to, uh, how many lives they might have had. Now you
There
don't.
are people. There are people in Stevenson's cases that remembered more than one life.
Now, was that through hypnotism?
No, no, no.
Really?
Yeah,
Oh, they didn't have to be hypnotized to remember?
right. Well,
Oh,
none of these children were hypnotized.
no, I know that, but I don't think, I think I remember you saying that. I was reading something about you guys don't want to go along with hypnotism. Oh, you said it tonight, hypnotism, because the hypnotist suggests this to you.
Right. You're
Uh,
supposed to. Right.
hmm, hmm. Okay. Now, did Dr. Stevenson ever talk about near death experiences and with these near death experiences, how they, go to heaven and they see all their relatives and all that?
Well, he had an institute at the University of Virginia that investigated near death experiences. I mean, that wasn't his particular thing, but he had colleagues who were doing with near death experiences what he was doing with these cases of recalled reincarnations.
Okay.
And, and there, there's some fascinating things where people like recounted the moment that where they quote died, and that they looked like they were floating up to the ceiling, and they could see things operating in the not only in the operating room where they were dying, but also outside in like the hospital courtyard and stuff. And they'd recount things that they saw going on, and that turned out to actually be accurate.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. My brother-in-law, that happened to him, but this was years ago, and you didn't talk about that stuff. And we didn't find out until he died. My sister told us that he had died on the operating table. He had a heart attack and they were doing surgery on him. And he saw himself up in the ceiling looking down on the doctors and his body. And then I guess he came back into his body. But in those days, you didn't talk about it. This
Yeah,
was,
well,
you know,
that's typical of these near-death experiences. There's a lot of things like that, and there was this one case in India where um, this little girl who remembered being part of this family who had lost a daughter at the age of 12, and the daughter had been killed in a car, had been hit by a car, and and the little girl said that she remembered sort of waiting, and then and and seeing. Oh, hello, excuse me,
yeah.
I got it.
Oh, that's okay. Lost your video.
Yeah, hold on. Anyway, sorry.
That's okay.
Um, so
Okay, wait a minute. I don't have your. There you go. There
yeah,
you go. Okay, continue.
and where was I? I was saying, oh, the that she remembered being in a place where she saw her new mother and thought she looked nice, so she decided that she would come down and be with that mother.
Okay,
That was her
so
explanation for it.
this is another thing we've always heard over the years, that you pick your parents. So that would be an instance where she picked her mother.
Right, but that's the only case like that that I ran into.
Okay, but that's the only one you ran into, but there's probably more. So
Yes,
now
yeah,
So
right.
now, now I'm wondering, is it true? Is it really true we pick our parents? But the thing about it is, what about these poor kids that get parents that are abusers? What about that?
Well, maybe they picked wrong.
I guess they did, but why would they pick some? So I'm
Well, I
wondering,
mean, we're leaping to the conclusion that people pick their parents based on again on not very much evidence, and there are many cases where nobody remembers anything about uh, before they were born, or an intermediate period between death and life. I mean, not
wow,
many people have that. Some people do, but not many.
no, um, and these people that have been hypnotized, that have been captured by taken up by aliens. They're the only time they remember is because they've all been hypnotized. Hey, I interviewed a guy in 2018, um, Paul Ameralt, and uh, was he was reincarnated. He was Jack Phillips. he was Jack Phillips was uh, the transmitter on you know, he's the one that sent out the SOS. He was the last one, and he was the last. It was the last message that they were hearing from on the Titanic, and it was Jack Phillips. And this Paul said that, and he wrote a book on it. The last message was an SOS. That's yeah. He said he's reincarnated. Jack Phillips. Pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Do you have any more stories for us that you could tell us?
Um,
I know what I wanted to ask you. Okay, now I've seen where the children um, once it was a little boy that said he was reincarnate of Princess Diana. Um, oh, there were some other famous people and pilots. And come across anything like that?
well, there was this American kid who um, who when he was very little, that he was fascinated with airplanes, World War II era airplanes, and he was looking at a picture of one, and it had this little sort of like bullet shaped object the below the cockpit or below the fuselage, and his mother says, "Oh, that's the bomb." And this little kid, he's like 4 years old. He says, "No, mom, that's not a bomb. That's a drop tank." And they they like are sort of, and he's insisting that that's what it is. And so they look up this plane, and it turns out that he was right. It was a drop tank. It was a extra gas from an air.
Wow.
And so then he started saying, that uh, he had been a pilot, and that he had been shot down. And then they were looking at a book with pictures of the Battle of Iwo Jima, and he says, "Dad, that's where I was shot. That's where my plane went down." And he'd have
Wow.
these nightmares where he'd say, "Little man, the plane's on fire. Little man can't get out." And he said,
Oh.
what his name was, and he said the name of what he said was his best friend, and he said the name of the ship that he said he was flying on, and all of that stuff checked out. There was a ship by the name that he said. There was and he said and he said what his name was, and there was a person by that name who was the only person on that ship to be lost, only flyer to be lost in combat. And
Wow.
and so, I mean, the family, they they wrote a book about it, and but it was pretty impressive stuff.
Um, when you came back from India or the Eastern world, did you continue on with investigating reincarnation?
No, no, I'm after I wrote the book, I just went back to being a journalist.
Oh, wow. Well, you're quite a wonderful journalist. I told the viewers about you.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think I gotta sign off now.
okay. Thank you so much, Tom,
Okay.
for joining us.
Thank
Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
you
Thank
too.
you.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night. Okay. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed the show. That was short. Hope you enjoyed the show. I don't have another one until July 11th. I count it with July. Anyway, I have a couple of shows, two or three shows in the month of July. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here. I'm sorry it was such a short show, but Tom was a great guest, and I enjoyed having him on the show. Um, okay. Uh, well, I guess I'll go. Um, Have a nice evening, you guys. Let me do a shout out. I saw Crystal was in the chat room. We miss you, Crystal. We miss you. It was nice to see you. I'm glad you guys like. Oh, so how was the audio? How was the audio, guys? It's our new audio setup. Okay. Um, so let me do some shout outs. Um, oh, I'm glad you guys liked it. I'm just sorry it was short. Um, okay. Let me do some shout outs. I just want you guys, I'm asking you how the audio was good. No, I know. I know, Tall Cross. Crystal, we miss you too. Anytime you want to come back, just come back. Okay, so let me, great. Oh, good. I'm so glad. Um, all right, so let me do some shout outs. Let me go back up here. All right. To my mods, Chipateri and Renee, thank you so much. I love you for always being here. Thank you so much. Um, love you too. Um, Tall Cross from my buddy from Scotland. So you got 2 hours earlier today, so you're not as up so late. So I'm glad that was nice to do a 4 o'clock show. I didn't mind that. So Tall Cross and Lori Miller, Lisa Scarrett. How'd it go for you tonight, Lisa? Did you hear me better tonight? Um, Sheila Pelican. Um, let's see. What else left in here? Oh, King of Hucamundo, I am Alpha. Anybody else want to shout out? Sarah Claire. Anybody else want to shout out? Betty Spaghetti. Love spaghetti. I sorry, Betty, we couldn't get to any questions. Anybody else shout out? Shelty Shangri-La. Crystal. Going through anybody else? Shelly Sykes. Lori Miller. Okay. Well, it was a good show. So thanks everybody again for coming here early. Um, I'll see you. Which I think it's July 11th. I know. I know. Oh, God, we're gonna do the show on Jenny Serenity. Jenny is coming. Um, on a show with that Christopher Tompkin who disappeared. Really strange. He was in the field working with his other fellow workers, and he was behind them. And there was a one of those iron fences with the prickly things. The iron fences, you know, get what they call them. and his friend was talking to him, and Christopher was in the back, and so his friend had expected an answer from Christopher because they had been carrying on a conversation, and the friend looks back, and Christopher had completely disappeared. He disappeared. He vanished. And they found on this fence, they found one of his shoes hanging over the fence, and a piece of his blue shirt that was ripped hanging on the fence. Really strange. So I'm really excited about that. Um, uh, see what she picks up on that. Let's see. Oh gosh, I don't know what I calendar. I'm sorry. Anyway, I got some good shows coming up. Um, I have another Bella coming on who had a near-death experience, and he's got a really lovely story to tell. It's going to be a nice one. Who else? I have a guy that had a horrible encounter with Bigfoot. It was either Bigfoot or Wolfman. It is one of the scariest stories I've ever heard. He's coming on the show. Who else? Oh God, I have so many shows lined up. I can't even remember. I can't do it without my calendar. Hi, Phantom. Okay, so I'm gonna go, and I'll see you guys on. I think it was, like I said, I think it's July 11th is the next show. So I love you guys and thank you so much. And I'll see you then and have a great weekend. Okay, love you guys. Good night. Thank you. Love you.